Congressman Khanna, just a few weeks ago, you said, quote, I believe that Joe Biden is going to be our nominee. I think the rest of it is sort of a West Wing episode, which is unlikely to happen. It makes for great entertainment, but isn't going to come to pass. That didn't age well.
No, it didn't. I'm glad you still had me on. Obviously, shows what I know. They had me. The Biden campaign had me on this week on Sunday, and then I was on Saki's show saying why he's should stay in and why I support him. And I think they had the press release or tweet being drafted at the same time. So obviously, very few people knew he was going to drop. But he's had an extraordinary legacy. I respect the decision he made. I didn't like the fact that the donors and the elected officials were sort of pushing him to make a decision. I think he had earned the right to make that decision for himself, having won 14 million votes. But now we move on. I've very enthusiastically endorsed Kamala Harris and think she's going to win and think she's an extraordinary candidate.
And with all due respect, I mean, time was of the essence, was it not, Congressman? I mean, with the Democratic National Convention soon, with the election, 106, 107 days away, he couldn't really bide his time in making this decision. Can you understand why people were getting anxious?
I do, but I guess I don't. We'll see. I mean, I hope the Vice President Harris wins, and I think she's got a great shot. But I think the president had a great shot. I think they both have different skills. I think the vice president's going to bring more energy. She's going to energize fundraising. She's going to energize young people, people of color. I think the vice president, as Scranton Joe, had a unique connection with older voters, with older white working class voters. And so I think they both had different paths to victory. And I thought it was the president's decision to make. And I would have been enthusiastic for either one of them.
Everyone has their coalitions, as you talked about just prior to President Biden's announcement saying he was going to not run for re-election. You said one of the things we underestimate is that Joe Biden actually has a coalition. African-American women, blue-collar workers, seniors who voted for him. And if he feels bullied out, his voters are going to be feel bullied out. Do you think there are hard feelings, or do you think people will quickly move on to support the vice president?
So I was in North Carolina campaigning when this happened. The African-American community has energized and mobilized around Kamala Harris in extraordinary ways. I mean, my colleagues were saying there was a phone call last night where they were expecting 1,000 Black women and 40,000 Black women were on the call. The party folks have mobilized. Seniors like my parents who didn't want Joe Biden to drop out are enthusiastic behind Kamala Harris. But in candor, Katie, the white working class, older white voters and working class voters in deindustrialized towns like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, I think that is going to be a challenge that we need to focus on. And Joe Biden had a unique connection, a unique story there.
How do you think Vice President Harris should make those connections and should energize those particular voters who are being lost by the Democratic Party, not just Kamala Harris, but Joe Biden even?
Well, one, we need to talk about that we're the party of bringing new factories. So I'm going to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and on this week and introducing a bill to create 5 new steel plants in America. We have 12 blast furnaces around America. We can have 5 new ones. They can be direct reduction iron or hydrogen. I've got United Steelworkers showing up, the CEO of Cleveland Cliffs showing up. I hope Vice President Harris will do that. We'll go into these towns and say, we're the party of new factories. I mean, J.D. Vance talks about it, and I believe he has genuine empathy for people left out of globalization. I read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, but I disagree with his solutions. His solution is sort of let's have corporate tax cuts and let's restrict legal immigration. That's not going to put up a factory in Youngstown or Johnstown. We need to be the party that makes the case that we have an actual plan to do that.
Maybe you should bring Vice President Harris with you.
She's busy, but I'd love to. I'm certainly going to talk to her about it. And I think she's got some great people to pick for vice president. Of course, the Governor Shapiro, who knows about my initiative, and Andy Beshear, people like that who really understand these communities, have been in these communities. I do think her pick for VP will matter.
Who do you think that might be?
Well, look. I think Gretchen Whitmer would be terrific. I think Josh Shapiro would be terrific.
I don't think America's ready for uh, two female candidates.
You know,
Do you?
I well,
I
you
mean,
were
I am, but
yeah.
I don't think America is.
Well, you were a trailblazer in your own field, Katie, so you would know. But I view it as sort of Clinton Gore doubling down on a new vision. But it is a gamble. If there's also Andy Bashir, there's Josh Shapiro, there's Mark Kelly. But my biggest criteria would be think of Scranton Joe and who can appeal to the voters that Scranton Joe could appeal to, because Joe Biden was not just a default choice. I was a co-chair of Bernie Sanders' campaign. To think that Joe Biden just won because he was the last man standing is to underestimate Joe Biden. Joe Biden had a large emotional connection with people who grew up in working class and middle class households in this country. And we need to make sure we're connecting with those folks.
Let's talk about Kamala Harris's strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, you're from California. You've known her for years. First, her strengths.
She's an embodiment of the American dream. When people look at her, they say, okay, here is an African American, Asian American woman who overcame all the odds, who was raised by a single mother, who worked her way up, worked as a DA, became the district attorney, became attorney general, became senator, vice president, and now she could become president of the United States. And if Kamala Harris can become president of the United States, anyone in America can become president of the United States.
What about her weaknesses?
Well, I think that she's going to have to go out and campaign, a retail campaign, and she's being thrust into this with 100 days to go. I mean, it's a very, very difficult task. It's like having your backup quarterback come in when you're down a touchdown or down 10 points, because we're obviously down in the polling. Now, we all know when that happens that the teams go on to win, but she's being put in a difficult position, and she's going to have to go campaign her heart out in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. She's capable of it, but that's going to be her challenge.
Let me tell you two lines of attack that the Republicans are already employing. One is that her job was to fix the border, which she did not do. The second is she is the first quote unquote DEI candidate, which I'm sure you've seen. And there are other things that they're criticizing her for. I'm trying to think of, it just flew out of my head. But what do you think about Republican arguments that she was in charge of the border and really didn't fix it, and that she is the first DEI candidate, that Joe Biden picked her as VP because she's a woman of color?
But the second one is silly, and I think will backfire, because people care what you're going to do about their families, what you're going to do about the country. Ron DeSantis ran a whole anti-DEI campaign. He attacked Disney, he attacked Mickey Mouse, he attacked companies, and it didn't go very far. Donald Trump is a more concerning candidate to me, because he's also a billionaire who has Trump buildings everywhere, and he gets people to feel wrongfully that he may help them become rich. But he has an economic vision as well. But the DEI stuff, if they attack her that way, I think actually will backfire, and it's not talking about the issues. The border is a real issue, but here I think Vice President Harris has to say, I was there to fix it. I preside over the Senate. We had a bipartisan bill, and Donald Trump sabotaged it. And I did my job. I helped create this bipartisan bill. I was leading in the Senate. We had bipartisan support. And look, Donald Trump wanted the issue, not the solution. And that, I think, would be a potent line of attack.
The other beef about her is that she's too progressive. And I'm curious, as someone watched her in California, I've also heard that she was too tough on crime. So can you, it must be hard to be a politician, Congressman, but where do you think she stands on that issue? Because I guess there were various actions she took as Attorney General that people found too tough on crime.
Well, look, I think she comes with public safety background, which is important, because in my district, we have one of the safest districts in the country, but we want people to have some consequence if they smash into Walgreens and take merchandise, or if they engage in carjacking. And Kamala Harris wrote a book called Smart on Crime. She said, I'm not for mandatory minimums. I'm not for locking people up with drug possession, but I am going to be for smart policies. And I think she just has to articulate that. But that, I think, actually allows her to separate from this defund the police movement that I don't think is how you win elections in states or what the American people want.
Let's talk about Project 2025 for a moment, something I know that you have been really focused on, and it only has recently emerged into the public consciousness. Tell us why this is something that you think is a very potent weapon for Democrats in this election cycle.
I think people just need to look at what Project 2025 calls for. It's a 900-page governing agenda. And it mentions abortion 200 times. It's an obsession. And it basically calls for a permanent national ban on all types of abortion. It calls for the elimination of the Department of Education. That means if you're a Title I school, if you got a kid with special needs, you're not going to get federal money if there's no Department of Education. It calls for cuts in Social Security and Medicare, raising the age. Now, Donald Trump promises that he's not going to make those cuts, but when he was president, he would introduce budgets with Social Security cuts and raising the Social Security retirement age. And there are hosts of other provisions like that. It says if you're trans, you can't serve in the military. So it's a very deep governing agenda. And my concern is, look, Donald Trump just wants to win. I think he would say anything. I've joked around that he would take half of Bernie's platform and say that if he thought he could get a good win. But now he comes in with a vindictiveness, with a crew of loyalists who have a deep agenda to transform this nation in a very, very conservative way and going backwards in many ways. And that should be chilling to Americans.
You believe that this is getting through to young voters. How could this help with growing awareness among all Democrats?
I do think it's actually getting through to young voters. And the reason I know this is my Twitter and my TikTok used to be filled, understandably, with people outraged about the lives lost in Gaza. And now a lot of it is filled with people talking about Project 2025. So for young voters, the threat of losing abortion rights, the threat of mass deportation, another thing I didn't mention, of anyone who's undocumented being forced out of America, something we haven't seen since the 1950s. According to Donald Trump himself, he said, yeah, we did this in the 1950s. Yes, Donald Trump, we did it in the 50s. Since then, we had a civil rights movement. But young people are really talking about this, and I think it's going to get them out to the polls. Plus, I think Vice President Harris is going to get them out to the polls. That is some strength of hers that she has over President Biden.
And Congressman, while you represent California, you grew up in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, in fact, a town called Newton. And you've said that your faith in this country comes from there. And I'm curious to hear your reaction to the assassination attempt against Donald Trump in your home state.
It was horrific, appalling, horrific. And thank God he was not seriously hurt and he survived on a human level for him and his family. But also, can you imagine, Katie, what would have happened to America if something bad had happened to him? I mean, we would have been torn apart in a very ugly way. And just today I was one of the few Democrats who called for the resignation of the director of the Secret Service. I mean, when Reagan was shot afterwards, the director technically retired, but his retirement was forced because people thought he didn't do his job well. And I don't see how a director of the Secret Service stays when you've had a former president and leading presidential candidate get shot, and when half the country doesn't think you're capable of protecting their leaders.
Is your real criticism about the fact that the Trump campaign had asked for more federal resources and they were denied that?
I think that has to be looked into. And if the people have to be held accountable, if the Secret Service needs more resources, well, we can provide them with more resources. I mean, we've got $1 trillion defense budget. What good is $1 trillion defense budget if we don't have enough resources to protect our presidents and our people running for president? I mean, that seems like such a small investment you'd want to make to keep this country secure.
You appear regularly on Fox News, something that is said to have impressed President Biden. And I'm just curious, as we approach this election in November, do you think that there's any way to bring Americans together, or are we hopelessly polarized? Because sometimes I wonder, gee, how do you mend this broken social fabric that is the United States of America?
It's the biggest question, Katie. And this is when I think about the kids I grew up in Bucks County, when we watched Rocky movies together and traded baseball cards and played street hockey and rooted for the Flyers and Eagles. And I don't even know many of their political affiliations, but it has to start with a love of this country, a belief that we have made so much progress. I mean, when I was growing up, my parents couldn't get a meeting with a staff member to a member of Congress. Today, you have 6 Indian Americans in Congress. I mean, this country is incredible. I mean, Kamala Harris is going to be the Democratic nominee. Let's celebrate the progress we've made in America and not always just dwell on the negative. And then when I go on Fox News, honest point here, I don't go to say, okay, how am I going to win the argument? I go thinking, okay, where are they coming from? What may I have missed? What could I learn? What can I do better to listen? And I think we all need that. No one has a monopoly of the truth in this country, but we have got the most open political process and open process for conversation of any place in the world. And we should celebrate that and try to listen to each other, to respect each other.
And learn how to use it properly, perhaps.
And learn how to use it properly. I mean, what you're doing here is a great use of social media. I mean, not all social media has to be negative or sensational. And I often say, look, when the printing press came out, Erasmus, who was a great champion of it, turns negative on the printing press because the pamphlets that they were putting out back then makes our social media look tame. I mean, it led to wars in Europe for 100 years. But you know what? People built the institutions of liberal democracy. Brilliant people wrote about it, like John Locke and then Madison. We have to build the digital institutions and do things like this to show that not all digital communication has to be misinformation or conspiracy theories.
Do you think you'd ever want to run for president, Congressman?
I'm hoping that Kamala Harris wins and then wins again. And so that is my focus. In the future, who knows what life would take. We don't know we didn't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be 4 weeks from now, let alone what's going to happen 10 years from now.
Well, Congressman Ro Khanna, thanks so much for spending some time with me. I know you need to head off to your next engagement, but I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I said this offline. I've long admired your career. I think you're a trailblazer as a journalist. I grew up watching you, and I appreciate how engaged you've remained in the public sphere.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.